The auction house reeked of desperation, cheap alcohol, and the acrid tang of fear that clung to every Omega being paraded across the raised platform like livestock at market. Mira stood in the holding pen backstage, her wrists bound with iron shackles that suppressed her already weak Omega instincts, listening to the cruel laughter and drunken jeers filtering through the moth-eaten curtain. She had stopped crying 3 days ago, when her parents had signed the papers transferring ownership of her to the Greyvale Auction Consortium, their hands shaking not with guilt, but with eagerness to collect the advance payment that would cover a fraction of their gambling debts. Her mother hadn't even looked at her as she pressed her thumbprint to the contract, and her father had muttered something about Mira finally being useful for once in her worthless life. 22 years of existence, and this was what it amounted to, standing in a cage waiting to be sold to whoever offered the lowest bid. For a defective Omega who couldn't fulfill the one biological purpose her kind was supposedly created for. The auctioneer's voice boomed through the speakers, slick and performative, as he described the next lot with the enthusiasm of someone selling a slightly damaged appliance. Lot 63, Omega female, age 22, designation certified infertile by 3 separate medical facilities, no heat cycles in 6 years, suitable for manual labor or basic domestic service, starting bid set at 200 silver marks. Mira felt the handler's rough grip on her arm as she was shoved toward the stage entrance, her bare feet stumbling on the splintered wooden floor. They had dressed her in a thin white shift that left little to the imagination, standard practice for Omega auctions, so potential buyers could assess the merchandise, though in Mira's case it hardly mattered since no one was buying her for her reproductive value. She was led onto the stage under the harsh glare of Enchanted, lights that made her squint, and the crowd's reaction was immediate and devastating. Laughter rippled through the assembled alphas and betas, some pointing at the documentation being projected onto the screens that flanked the stage, others making crude jokes about what use an infertile Omega could possibly serve. The auctioneer tried to drum up interest with practiced patter about her youth and her undamaged physical condition, neglecting to mention the psychological damage that came standard, with being told since 16 that you were biologically broken. But the bids came in low and mocking. 200 silver marks from a textile factory owner who needed someone to work the looms 16 hours a day. 250 from a tavern keeper known for working his staff until they collapsed. 300 from a farming collective that went through Omegas like disposable tools, replacing them when they broke from exhaustion. Mira stood there with her head down and her hands clenched into fists, trying to disappear into herself, the way she had learned to do over years of being reminded that she was less than worthless. The auctioneer was starting to sound desperate, ready to close the bidding at 325 marks to a particularly brutal-looking alpha in the front row, who owned a mining operation in the Northern Territories, where Omegas rarely survived more than 2 years, when the massive doors at the back of the auction house exploded inward with enough force to tear them off their hinges. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees in an instant, as power rolled through the space like a physical wave, pressing down on every person present with the weight of absolute dominance. Mira's knees buckled, and she would have collapsed if not for the auctioneer's podium she grabbed onto, her Omega instincts that had been dormant for so long suddenly screaming at her to submit to the apex predator that had just entered the building. Alpha, her wolf whimpered in the back of her mind where it had been silent for years. Alpha, alpha, alpha. But not just any alpha. This was the kind of power that made even other alphas drop their eyes and bare their throats, the kind of dominance that spoke of ancient bloodlines and absolute authority. The crowd had gone utterly silent. Every head turned toward the entrance where a figure stood backlit by the evening light streaming through the destroyed doorway, flanked by 6 warriors in the silver and black armor that everyone in the 5 kingdoms recognized instantly. The royal guard only accompanied one person, and that person had no business being in a third-rate auction house in a border city known primarily for its criminal enterprises and its willingness to look the other way on trafficking operations. Alpha King Demon Silvercrest moved through the frozen crowd with the lethal grace of an apex predator, his warriors fanning out to secure the exits while he walked down the center aisle, with his eyes fixed on the stage where Mira stood trembling and confused and utterly terrified. He was massive even by Alpha standards. easily 6.5 feet of pure muscle wrapped in elegant black clothing that probably cost more than everything Mira had ever owned in her entire life. With dark hair that fell to his shoulders and eyes that gleamed like molten silver in the harsh stage lights. His face could have been carved from granite, all sharp angles and masculine beauty that would have been almost pretty, if not for the raw danger that emanated from him like heat from a forge. Every instinct Mira possessed was screaming contradictory messages, her Omega side desperate to get closer to that overwhelming alpha presence, while her rational mind gibbered in terror about why the most powerful werewolf in the known world was staring at her like she was the only person in the room. The auctioneer had gone pale as death, stammering something about being honored by His Majesty's presence and asking how the auction house could serve the crown. But Demon ignored him completely as he mounted the stage steps with fluid power. Mira couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but stand there as Demon closed the distance between them with measured steps, his silver eyes raking over her with an intensity that made her skin prickle with awareness. He stopped less than 3 feet away, and she could smell him now. Cedar and winter wind, and something wild and dangerous that made her wolf keen with recognition, even as Mira's conscious mind struggled to understand what was happening. When he spoke, his voice was a deep rumble that resonated in her chest, pitched low enough that it was clearly meant for her alone, despite the hundreds of people straining to hear. "Mate," he said, and that single word detonated like a bomb in the silence. "Mate, mine." And Mira felt something snap into place in her chest that she hadn't even known was missing, a connection that blazed to life between them with enough force to make her gasp. It wasn't possible, she thought wildly. She was broken and defective and incapable of the kind of bond he was claiming, but her wolf was howling in recognition and joy and desperate need, completely bypassing 6 years of silence to respond to the call of its destined other half. The auction house erupted into chaos as the implications of what the Alpha King had just declared crashed over the crowd like a tidal wave. Demon turned to face them with eyes that had gone completely wolf, silver bleeding into the whites as his beast rose close to the surface, and the sheer dominance radiating from him sent every alpha in the room to their knees in automatic submission. His voice, when he spoke again, carried the weight of absolute command, pitched to be heard by everyone present as he addressed the now terrified auctioneer. "I am claiming this Omega under ancient mate law," he said flatly, "which supersedes all contracts of sale or ownership and nullifies any debts or obligations attached to her person. I will pay whatever sum was expected for her purchase, plus 20 times that amount as the traditional mate claim compensation to her family, though they deserve nothing for selling their own blood. Have your financial officer prepare the paperwork immediately, and be aware that this establishment is now under investigation by the Crown for trafficking operations. My agents will be conducting a full audit of your records and interviewing every Omega currently held on these premises. If you have any documentation that is less than completely legal, I suggest you pray to the Moon Goddess for mercy, because you will receive none from me." Mira swayed on her feet as the reality of the situation crashed over her. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen to broken Omegas who had been thrown away by their own families. But Demon was already moving to unlock her shackles with a key he had taken from one of his guards. The moment the iron fell away from her wrists, she felt the suppression lift, and her Omega instincts came flooding back with overwhelming intensity. The mate bond that had just formed between them, amplifying every sensation until she was drowning in the feeling of rightness and completion and home. Demon caught her before she could collapse, lifting her into his arms with effortless strength, and despite everything Mira had been through, despite every reason she had to be terrified of this powerful stranger who had just upended her entire existence, she felt safe for the first time in years as she tucked her face against his throat and breathed in his scent. He carried her out of the auction house while his guards efficiently took control of the situation, loading her into a carriage marked with the royal crest that was far more luxurious than anything she had ever seen, let alone ridden in. And as they pulled away from the building that would have been the site of her enslavement, Mira finally allowed herself to break down and cry, while her mate held her and promised in a rough voice that no one would ever hurt her again. The journey to the capital took 3 days by carriage, and Mira spent most of it in a state of shocked confusion, trying to process the fact that her entire life had been turned upside down in a matter of minutes. Demon was patient with her, giving her space when she needed it, but staying close enough that the mate bond between them didn't cause painful separation anxiety. And he explained in careful detail exactly what claiming her as his mate meant both personally and politically. The personal part she was starting to understand. The inexplicable pull between them that made her wolf purr with contentment whenever he was near. The way her body responded to his presence with a heat and awareness she had never experienced before. The absolute certainty in her bones that this alpha was meant to be hers, and she was meant to be his. The political part was far more terrifying because Demon was already married, had been for 10 years to Lady Seraphina Moonwhisper, an omega of impeccable breeding, who had given him 2 healthy heirs and served as his Luna Queen with grace and political acumen. True mate bonds were supposed to be sacred and unbreakable according to ancient werewolf law, but Demon's marriage to Seraphina had been arranged by the Council of Alphas when he first took the throne at age 25, a political alliance designed to unite 2 powerful families and stabilize his rule after his father's sudden death. Demon told her all of this in a flat voice that carried undertones of old bitterness, explaining that he had never felt even a whisper of a mate bond with Seraphina. Despite their decade together, their relationship had always been one of mutual respect and political partnership, rather than romantic love. He had assumed, like most wolves did, that true mates were rare enough to be almost mythical, that most people never found theirs and built satisfying lives with chosen partners instead. So he had done his duty as king, and married the Omega the council had selected for him. His 2 children, Crown Prince Adrian age 9 and Princess Celeste age 7, were the lights of his life, and he loved them fiercely. But he had long since resigned himself to a marriage that was comfortable, but emotionally hollow. Then 3 weeks ago, he had woken from a dead sleep with his wolf howling in. His head about mate, nearby mate, in danger mate needs us. And the pull had been so strong that he had nearly shifted right there in his bedchamber. He had followed the instinct across half the kingdom like a bloodhound on a scent trail, unable to rest or focus on anything else until he tracked the source to a rundown auction house in a border city. And the moment he had seen Mira standing on that stage in chains, something fundamental had settled into place in his soul. Now they were racing back, to the capital where a political nightmare awaited them. Because while ancient mate law technically gave Demon the right to dissolve his marriage to Seraphina in favor of his true mate, doing so would create a scandal that could destabilize the entire kingdom. Seraphina's family controlled 3 of the major packs in the Eastern Territories. Their support had been crucial to Demon maintaining his throne in the chaotic years after his father's death, and they would see the dissolution of her marriage as a grave insult that demanded recompense. More than that, Seraphina herself was beloved by the common people for her charity work and her advocacy for Omega rights. Ironically enough, given that she was about to be replaced by another Omega, and the court nobles who owed their positions to her patronage would fight viciously to protect their access to power. Demon's children adored their mother and would be devastated by their parents' separation, and he was clearly wrestling with guilt over the pain he was about to cause them, even as his wolf demanded he claim his mate properly, and damn the political consequences. Mira listened to all of this with growing dread, understanding that her presence was about to tear apart a family and potentially ignite civil conflict. But when she hesitantly suggested that maybe she should just disappear to spare everyone the trouble, Demon's eyes had flashed pure wolf silver, and he had growled that she was his mate, and he would burn the world down before he let her go. They arrived at the royal palace just after dawn on the 4th day, and Mira's first glimpse of her new home made her breath catch in her throat, because it looked like something out of a fairy tale. All soaring towers and elegant architecture crafted from white stone that glowed in the early morning light. The palace grounds sprawled across several square miles and included elaborate gardens, training grounds for the royal guard, administrative buildings that housed the kingdom's government, and living quarters for hundreds of nobles and staff. Demon took her directly to the royal wing, where he maintained his private apartments, bypassing the throne room and the council chambers where he would normally conduct business, and Mira understood that he was trying to give her time to adjust before throwing her into the shark tank of court politics. A team of Omega attendants was waiting for them, carefully selected by Demon during the journey for their discretion and their lack of loyalty to any particular noble faction, and they whisked Mira away for a proper bath and fresh clothing, while Demon went to handle the immediate crisis of his sudden return with an unclaimed Omega in tow. The attendants treated her with a deference that made her deeply uncomfortable, because she wasn't used to being treated as a person with value, and they explained in gentle voices that His Majesty had given strict orders that she was to be shown every courtesy as his mate and future Luna Queen. The title made Mira's stomach clench with anxiety because she wasn't anyone's idea of queen material. She was an infertile Omega from a disgraced family who had been sold at auction for pocket change. But the attendants insisted that mate bonds were gifts from the moon goddess herself and trumped all considerations of birth or status. They dressed her in elegant clothing that actually fit properly and styled her dark hair into something presentable, and when Mira looked at her reflection in the full-length mirror, she barely recognized herself. The girl staring back at her looked almost regal, despite the fear in her hazel eyes. Nothing like the broken creature who had stood on an auction block 4 days ago, waiting to be sold to the lowest bidder. If you're enjoying this story of an Omega who was discarded by everyone until fate itself intervened, please consider liking this video and sharing your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever felt underestimated because of circumstances beyond your control? Let me know what you think will happen when Mira meets the current Luna Queen face to face, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next part of this journey. Demon returned several hours later, looking grimly determined, and he explained that he had already set the political machinery in motion to dissolve his marriage to Seraphina and formally recognize Mira as his mate. The news had spread through the court like wildfire, and reactions were exactly as catastrophic as expected, with Seraphina's family demanding an emergency session of the Council of Alphas, and several prominent nobles threatening to withdraw their support from the crown entirely. Seraphina herself had requested a private audience with Demon, which he had declined for the moment because he needed to present a united front with Mira before engaging in what would undoubtedly be a brutal political battle. Instead, he had scheduled a formal presentation ceremony for that evening, where he would introduce Mira to the entire court and officially declare his intention to claim her as his Luna Queen, forcing everyone to acknowledge the mate bond publicly before they had time to organize effective opposition. It was a bold and risky move that would either cement Mira's position or paint a target on her back for every enemy Demon had made during his reign. But he seemed confident that the ancient laws regarding true mates would prevail. Over political maneuvering, Mira spent the afternoon being coached by a protocol instructor on proper court etiquette and how to conduct herself during the presentation ceremony, and she absorbed the information with the desperate intensity of someone whose survival depended on not making any catastrophic mistakes. The instructor was an elderly beta woman named Margot, who had served the royal family for 40 years, and she was surprisingly kind, as she explained the complex web of allegiances and rivalries that defined court politics. Lady Seraphina was well liked by most of the nobility because she was intelligent and politically savvy, Margot explained carefully. But her family, the Moon Whispers, were known for their ruthless ambition and their willingness to destroy anyone who threatened their access to power. The fact that Demon was dissolving their connection to the throne would be seen as a declaration of war, and they would strike back however they could. Mira should expect vicious rumors about her background and her motives, attempts to paint her as a gold digger who had somehow tricked the king into believing in a false mate bond, and possibly even direct threats to her safety if the Moon Whispers felt desperate enough. The presentation ceremony that evening was held in the Grand Hall, an enormous room with soaring ceilings and walls lined with portraits of previous rulers, and it seemed like every noble in the kingdom had managed to secure an invitation despite the short notice. Mira stood in an antechamber with Demon while they waited for the formal announcement, wearing an elegant gown in deep sapphire blue that the attendants had assured her was appropriate for her soon-to-be position, and she was shaking so badly that Demon had to take her hands in his to steady her. He looked magnificent in formal black and silver that marked him unmistakably as royalty. and the mate bond between them hummed with energy that helped ground her spiraling anxiety. When the herald announced their entrance, the massive doors swung open, and Demon led her into the hall, with his hand firmly clasping hers. And Mira felt hundreds of eyes lock onto her, with expressions ranging from curiosity to hostility to barely concealed contempt. Demon guided her to the raised dais at the front of the hall, where 2 thrones sat side by side, though only one was occupied, because apparently Seraphina had chosen not to attend this particular humiliation, and he turned to face the assembled court with the absolute authority of a ruler who expected to be obeyed. His voice when he spoke carried to every corner of the massive space, amplified by the excellent acoustics and by the alpha command he layered into his words. "Lords and ladies of the realm," he began, "I have called you here tonight to witness an event that occurs perhaps once in a century, the discovery of a true mate bond sanctioned by the moon goddess herself and recognized by ancient law as sacred and inviolable. This woman, Mira Ashwood, is my destined mate, confirmed by the bond that formed between us the moment we met, and verified by the court's bonding specialists who examined us this afternoon. Under the authority granted to me by mate law and by my position as Alpha King, I am formally dissolving my political marriage to Lady Seraphina Moonwhisper and claiming Mira as my mate and future Luna Queen. I understand this decision will be controversial, and I welcome discussion through proper channels. But let me be absolutely clear about one thing. The mate bond is not negotiable. It is not subject to political manipulation, and anyone who attempts to harm or undermine my mate will be considered an enemy of the crown and treated accordingly. The hall erupted into chaos as nobles shouted questions and objections, some demanding proof of the mate bond, while others protested the treatment of Lady Seraphina. And through it all, Demon stood like a mountain with Mira's hand clutched in. While his guards moved to strategic positions around the room, Mira could feel hostile eyes boring into her from every direction, and she understood with perfect clarity that her life had just become infinitely more dangerous. But then Demon turned and drew her close and kissed her in front of the entire assembled court, with a possessive intensity that left no doubt about his claim. The mate bond flared between them like lightning, and Mira felt her Omega instincts rise to meet his Alpha. Dominance with a rightness that transcended all the political complications. And when they finally broke apart, the hall had gone silent as people processed the very obvious chemistry between them. Demon announced that a formal coronation ceremony would be scheduled within the month to officially install Mira as Luna Queen, and until then she would reside in the royal wing under his protection, and anyone who wished to approach her would do so through proper diplomatic channels. The aftermath of that disastrous presentation ceremony played out over the following weeks, like a slow-motion political explosion, and Mira found herself at the center of a storm that threatened to tear the kingdom apart. Lady Seraphina, who had maintained dignified silence immediately after Demon's announcement, launched a sophisticated campaign to destroy Mira's reputation and paint herself as the wronged wife being cast aside for a younger model. She gave carefully crafted interviews to the kingdom's news, publications where she spoke with grace about her heartbreak, while subtly implying that Mira must have used some kind of dark magic to manufacture a false mate bond, because surely the moon goddess wouldn't choose an infertile Omega with no family name or accomplishments to be queen when Seraphina had served the role perfectly well for a decade. She made public appearances with her children where photographers captured heart-wrenching images of the family that was being torn apart, and she accepted sympathy from the noble families who depended on Moonwhisper patronage, while carefully positioning herself as a victim of Demon's cruel abandonment. The rumors spread through the court like poison, whispered conversations that painted Mira as everything from a scheming social climber to a witch who had ensorcelled the king with forbidden magic. Someone leaked her auction records to the press, and suddenly everyone knew that she had been sold as an infertile Omega, which fed perfectly into the narrative that she couldn't possibly be a real mate, because true bonds were supposed to result in powerful offspring, and how could a defective Omega provide that? Anonymous letters arrived at the palace daily, calling Mira every vile name imaginable, and demanding that Demon come to his senses before she destroyed the kingdom with her greed. Several minor nobles who owed their positions to Seraphina's patronage publicly withdrew their support from the crown, and whispers of potential rebellion started circulating among the eastern pacts where Moon Whisper influence was strongest. Through all of this, Demon remained absolutely steadfast in his support of Mira, but she could see the strain wearing on him as he tried to manage both his duties as king and the escalating political crisis. He had moved Mira into his private chambers both to protect her from potential attacks and to strengthen their bond, but the arrangement meant they were living in intimate proximity while still navigating the complicated process of actually getting to know each other. The mate bond created intense physical and emotional connection between them, but it didn't automatically provide the trust and understanding that came from shared experiences and time. Mira found herself falling genuinely in love with Demon as she saw how he handled the crisis with integrity while also being a devoted father to his children, who he made sure to spend time with every day despite the chaos. Adrian and Celeste were understandably confused and hurt by their parents' separation, and while Demon was honest with them about the mate bond, he was also careful not to speak badly about their mother or force them to accept Mira before they were ready. Mira herself was struggling with overwhelming guilt about the pain her presence was causing, particularly to two innocent children who hadn't asked for their family to be torn apart. She tried to stay out of Adrian and Celeste's way because she didn't want to add to their trauma, but one afternoon she stumbled upon Celeste crying in one of the palace gardens, and her instincts wouldn't let her just walk away. She sat down on the bench next to the little girl and asked gently if she wanted to talk about it, and Celeste had looked at her with Demon's silver eyes full of tears and asked why Mira wanted to steal her father away from her mother. The question hit Mira like a physical blow, but she forced herself to answer honestly, explaining that she didn't want to steal anyone or hurt anyone, but sometimes the moon goddess gave people connections they didn't expect and couldn't control. She told Celeste that loving Demon didn't mean she wanted to erase Seraphina from their family, and that she understood if Celeste never wanted to accept her, because protecting your mother was an honorable and important thing. Something in Mira's genuine distress and obvious guilt seemed to get through to Celeste. And while the little girl didn't forgive her, she did stop crying and admitted that her mother had told her Mira was evil, but she didn't seem evil, just sad. That conversation marked a turning point because Celeste apparently told her brother about it, and Adrian approached Mira a few days later to ask direct questions about her intentions and her background. He was 9, and surprisingly mature for his age, clearly groomed from birth to someday be king, and he interrogated Mira with the seriousness of a council member conducting an investigation. She answered every question as honestly as she could, including the painful details about being sold at auction and being diagnosed as infertile. And she saw Adrian's expression shift from suspicion to something like sympathy as he realized she hadn't chosen any of this any more than he had. He asked her if she would make his father happy, and she said she would try her absolute hardest. And he asked if she would try to replace his mother, and she said she would never try to do that because mothers were irreplaceable. Adrian studied her for a long moment, and then announced that he would give her a chance to prove she wasn't what everyone was saying about her. But if she hurt his father or his sister, he would find a way to make her regret it, even though he was only 9. Mira had to smile despite her anxiety, because the kid had his father's intensity and sense of honor, and she promised him that his protection of his family was exactly what a good prince should do. 3 weeks after the disastrous presentation ceremony, just as preparations were beginning for Mira's coronation, she woke up in the middle of the night feeling like her body was on fire from the inside out. She stumbled out of bed disoriented and feverish, her skin hypersensitive and her wolf howling with need, and it took her several confused minutes to recognize what was happening because she hadn't experienced it in over 6 years. Heat, her omega instincts screamed at her. Heat need. Alpha need mate, and her scent exploded through the room with enough intensity to wake Demon from a dead sleep. He was at her side in seconds with his eyes blown wide and pure alpha pheromones rolling off him in waves, and Mira felt the mate bond between them snap taut with urgent necessity. This wasn't supposed to be possible, she thought wildly, even as her body betrayed her with desperate need. She was infertile and broken, and heats required functional omega biology. But her wolf didn't care about medical diagnoses as it reached for its mate with single-minded focus. Demon was fighting for control with visible effort, his alpha instincts demanding he claim his mate properly, while his rational mind tried to make sure Mira was actually consenting and not just overwhelmed by heat biology. He asked her roughly if she was sure, if this was what she wanted. And Mira managed to gasp out yes between waves of need, because the mate bond was singing between them, and her Omega side was absolutely certain this was right. What followed was intense and overwhelming, and exactly what both their wolves needed. The final cementing of their bond in the most primal way possible. And when Mira finally came back to herself hours later, she was wrapped in Demon's arms with her body aching pleasantly, and her wolf purring with utter satisfaction. Demon looked stunned and almost reverent as he traced gentle fingers down her spine, and he murmured that her scent during heat had been unlike anything he had encountered before, carrying undertones of power and ancient bloodlines that suggested she was far more than the unwanted Omega her family had discarded. The palace healers were summoned at dawn, and they conducted extensive examinations of Mira, while Demon paced outside the medical wing like a caged predator. And when they finally emerged, their expressions were shocked. Head healer Rowan, an ancient wolf who had served 4 generations of the royal family, delivered her findings, in a shaking voice that carried weight beyond the medical details. Lady Mira was never infertile, she explained. Her reproductive system was suppressed by years of exposure to silver thread poison, a rare and expensive toxin that specifically targets Omega fertility without causing obvious symptoms. Someone had been dosing her systematically from around age 14, right before her wolf would have matured enough for her first heat, and the damage accumulated until her body stopped cycling entirely. The good news was that the poison was now flushing from her system thanks to the mate bond which had jump-started her healing, and there was no reason to believe she couldn't conceive and carry healthy children. The bad news was that silver thread poison wasn't something anyone could accidentally ingest. It had to be administered deliberately and consistently over years, which meant someone in Mira's family had been poisoning her with the specific intent of destroying her fertility. The revelation sent Mira reeling, because it recontextualized her entire childhood. All those years of being told she was broken and defective hadn't been cruel fate, but deliberate sabotage by someone she should have been able to trust. Demon's rage was a palpable thing that made the windows rattle in their frames, his alpha instincts screaming at him to find whoever had harmed his mate and tear them apart. But head healer Rowan wasn't finished with her shocking discoveries. The healer explained that during heat an Omega's true scent signature emerged without suppressants or blockers, and Mira's scent carried markers that shouldn't exist in a common-born Omega. Specifically, she carried the distinctive amber and lightning signature of House Stormborn, one of the 3 primordial houses that had founded the werewolf kingdoms over 1,000 years ago, and were believed to have died out 3 centuries past. If Mira carried Stormborn blood, then she wasn't the no-name Omega everyone assumed. She was hidden royalty from a bloodline that predated even Demon's own ancient family. The implications were staggering and raised far more questions than answers. But the immediate priority was figuring out who had poisoned Mira and why. Demon dispatched his best investigators to track down Mira's family, the people who had sold her at auction, and what they uncovered was a conspiracy that went far deeper than simple parental cruelty. The couple who had raised Mira and sold her weren't her biological parents at all. They were distant cousins who had been paid handsomely by an anonymous benefactor to take in an infant Omega and raise her in obscurity while dosing her with silver thread poison to prevent her heritage from being discovered. The real money had come with specific instructions that Mira was never to be allowed to come into heat or form strong social bonds, and if she became too much trouble or too curious about her origins, they were authorized to dispose of her however they saw fit. The auction sale had been their chosen disposal method once Mira reached adulthood and started asking uncomfortable questions about why she didn't look like either of her supposed parents. Demon's investigators managed to trace the anonymous payments back through several shell companies and eventually to an organization that made everyone in the kingdom go cold with recognition. The Order of the Crimson Moon was a secret society that most people dismissed as conspiracy theory or historical fiction, supposedly a group of powerful wolves who had been manipulating bloodlines and political succession for centuries, with the goal of concentrating power in a chosen few families. According to the conspiracy theories, the Order viewed true mate bonds as threats to their carefully constructed political marriages, and they had been quietly eliminating destined mates for generations to ensure power flowed through channels they could control. Most scholars considered this paranoid nonsense, but the financial evidence was undeniable. Someone within the Order had paid to hide Mira away and destroy her fertility so she could never claim her Stormborn heritage or form the kind of powerful mate bond that could disrupt their plans. The investigation took a darker turn when Demon's people started looking into other suspicious deaths and disappearances over the past century, and they found a disturbing pattern of wolves, with rare bloodlines dying in accidents or vanishing without trace, right around the age when mate bonds typically formed. Even more damning, several of these cases had connections to the Moonwhisper family, who had been prominent members of the nobility for generations and had somehow always managed to position themselves advantageously during political upheavals. Demon ordered a deeper investigation specifically into Lady Seraphina's background, and what they found was explosive. Seraphina herself was a high-ranking member of the Order of the Crimson Moon, initiated at age 16 and responsible for intelligence gathering and bloodline tracking. Her marriage to Demon hadn't been a simple political arrangement, but a calculated Order operation to place one of their members in position as Luna Queen, where she could influence policy and identify any threats to their agenda. More damning still, the investigators found evidence that Seraphina had known about Demon's true mate for nearly 5 years. The Order had identified Mira when she was 17 and living with her fake family, and Seraphina had personally authorized the continued poisoning to keep her suppressed until they could arrange a permanent solution. The only reason Mira had survived long enough for Demon to find her was because the Order moved slowly and carefully to avoid drawing attention. They had been planning to stage her death in a mining accident or factory fire in another year or two, once they had thoroughly documented her bloodline for their records. Demon finding her at the auction and claiming her publicly had been a catastrophic failure of their centuries-long operation, and now Seraphina and her Order allies were scrambling to salvage the situation by destroying Mira's credibility before the truth about Stormborn bloodlines and deliberate mate bond interference could come to light. When Demon confronted Seraphina with the evidence in a private meeting that his guards recorded for legal purposes, she didn't even bother denying it. She sat across from him in the study they had shared for 10 years, and calmly explained that the Order had been protecting werewolf civilization from chaos and instability by ensuring power remained with families who had proven they could handle it responsibly. True mate bonds were beautiful in theory, but disastrous in practice, because they prioritized individual passion over political stability, and the Order had prevented countless civil wars and succession crises by arranging strategic marriages. Instead, she had genuinely grown to respect Demon during their decade together, and she had hoped he would be reasonable about the Mira situation, perhaps keeping her as a mistress while maintaining Seraphina as his political Luna. But his insistence on following ancient mate law was going to destabilize everything the Order had built. As for the poisoning and attempted murder of his mate, Seraphina regarded that as an unfortunate but necessary measure to prevent the resurrection of Primordial bloodlines, which the Order viewed as existential threats to the current power structure. Demon's wolf had nearly broken free during that conversation, and only iron control kept him from shifting and tearing Seraphina apart where she sat. But he forced himself to follow proper legal procedure because this was bigger than personal revenge. He had Seraphina arrested on charges of conspiracy to commit murder, operating a criminal organization, and high treason against the crown. And he ordered simultaneous raids on known Order safe houses across the kingdom. The evidence they uncovered was overwhelming. Centuries of records documenting bloodline manipulation and political assassinations, financial ledgers showing payments to corrupt officials and hired killers, and lists of current Order members that included some of the most powerful nobles in the 5 kingdoms. The scandal exploded across every news publication in the realm, and suddenly the narrative shifted dramatically. Mira wasn't a scheming social climber, but a survivor of a massive conspiracy, and Demon wasn't a cruel husband abandoning his wife, but a king who had unknowingly married an enemy operative. Public opinion turned on a coin as people realized that the Order of the Crimson Moon wasn't conspiracy theory but horrifying fact, and that Lady Seraphina had been lying to everyone, including her own children, for their entire marriage. The noble families who had been supporting Seraphina out of loyalty, or political calculation, suddenly found themselves under investigation for order ties, and several prominent houses collapsed entirely as their crimes came to light. The Moonwhisper family tried to distance themselves from Seraphina by claiming she had acted alone, but the evidence showed multiple family members were Order operatives, and the entire house had benefited from Order machinations for generations. Demon moved swiftly to consolidate power and prevent the Order's remaining members from organizing resistance, and he did something that hadn't been done in 300 years, by invoking the ancient authority of primordial law, which superseded even council decisions when primordial bloodlines were threatened. Standing before an emergency session of the Council of Alphas with Mira at his side and his eyes blazing wolf silver, Demon declared that the Order of the Crimson Moon had committed crimes against the moon goddess herself by deliberately destroying mate bonds and attempting to eliminate primordial bloodlines. Under primordial law, he was dissolving his marriage to Seraphina immediately on grounds of fraud and conspiracy, and he was claiming Mira as his Luna Queen, effective immediately, regardless of any political objections. Furthermore, he was implementing sweeping reforms that would dismantle the systems the Order had used to maintain power, starting with complete abolition of the Omega trade and forced bonding practices. He announced the creation of new laws that protected Omega reproductive rights and criminalized coercive mating, and he established independent tribunals to hear cases of alpha abuse without political interference. Every law that treated Omegas as property, rather than people, was struck from the books, and any alpha who violated these new protections would face punishment up to and including execution regardless of their rank or family connections. The reforms were radical enough to spark genuine resistance from traditionalist alphas who saw their power being dismantled. But Demon had the full weight of primordial law behind him, and his investigators had evidence of Order involvement in enough major houses that resistance crumbled quickly. The Council of Alphas had no choice but to ratify his decisions because the alternative was admitting they had been manipulated by a criminal conspiracy for generations, and most council members were eager to distance themselves from the scandal by supporting the king's reforms. Demon also made a brilliant political move by revealing publicly that Mira carried Stormborn bloodline, one of the 3 primordial houses, which gave her unquestionable right to the Luna Queen position regardless of her common upbringing. If he and Mira produced children, they would unite Silvercrest and Stormborn blood for the first time in a millennium, creating wolves of extraordinary power who could potentially awaken the ancient magics that had been lost when the primordial houses declined. Mira's coronation as Luna Queen took place 6 weeks after Demon had claimed her at the auction house, and it was nothing like the hostile presentation ceremony that had introduced her to the court. This time the grand hall was filled with wolves who were genuinely curious about the resurrected Stormborn bloodline and supportive of the king's reforms. And when Mira walked down the aisle in ceremonial robes marked with the lightning bolt sigil of House Stormborn, she held her head high with confidence. She had earned through surviving everything the Order had thrown at her. Demon performed the coronation personally, placing the Luna Queen's crown on her head, while the mate bond blazed between them for everyone to feel. And when she turned to face the assembled court as their new queen, the applause was thunderous and genuine. She gave a speech that she had written herself about her journey from being sold as worthless property to standing as Luna Queen, and she promised to use her position to ensure no other Omega would ever be discarded or abused the way she had been. The weeks and months that followed were a whirlwind of activity as Mira threw herself into her new role with passionate determination. She established sanctuaries for Omegas rescued from trafficking and abuse, safe places where they could heal and learn skills that would let them build independent lives. She created the first academy where Omegas could study subjects beyond domestic preparation, offering courses in arts and sciences and political theory taught by some of the kingdom's best scholars. She worked with Demon's legal advisors to draft comprehensive Omega rights legislation that protected everything from reproductive choice to property ownership to legal representation. She made public appearances, where she spoke openly about her own experiences with being labeled defective and discarded, and her honesty resonated with common wolves who had similar stories of being judged and diminished by systems that valued them only for their biology. Mira also made genuine efforts to minimize the trauma to Adrian and Celeste, even though Serafina was now in prison awaiting trial for her crimes. She never spoke badly about their mother in their presence, and she made sure they received therapy to help them process the complicated emotions of learning their mother had been living a lie. She didn't try to force a relationship with them, but she was consistently present and kind. And over time, the children began to cautiously accept her as part of their lives, if not as a replacement for their mother. Adrian, in particular, seemed to respect Mira's honesty and her obvious dedication to helping people, and he started asking her questions about her policy work and her vision for the kingdom's future. Celeste took longer to warm up, but eventually admitted that she liked having someone who listened to her feelings without trying to tell her what she should think. 6 months after her coronation, Mira discovered she was pregnant, and the joy that flooded through her at the confirmation was almost overwhelming, because for so many years she had believed her body was broken beyond repair. Demon was equally thrilled and terrified, his alpha instincts going into overdrive about protecting his mate and their developing child, and he drove the palace staff crazy with his demands for the best prenatal care and the most secure arrangements possible. The pregnancy was announced publicly and became a cause for kingdom-wide celebration, particularly among common wolves who saw it as proof that even those labeled defective could thrive when given proper support and care. Mira's pregnancy also proved definitively that the silver thread poisoning had been the only thing preventing her fertility, not any inherent biological flaw, and several other Omegas came forward with similar stories of being diagnosed as infertile, only to discover they had been poisoned to hide their bloodlines or prevent inconvenient mate bonds. The trial of Lady Serafina and her order co-conspirators became the most closely watched legal proceeding in the kingdom's history, and the evidence presented was so damning that even her staunchest supporters couldn't deny her guilt. She was convicted on all charges and sentenced to life imprisonment in a high-security facility far from the capital, with the understanding that her children would be permitted supervised visits if they chose to maintain contact with her. The Moonwhisper family was stripped of most of their titles and holdings as punishment for their order ties, though Demon made sure that innocent family members who could prove they had no knowledge of the conspiracy were allowed to keep enough resources to maintain dignity. Several other noble houses fell entirely as their order connections were exposed, and the resulting power vacuum was filled by families who supported the king's reforms or by common-born wolves who had proven their competence in the new merit-based systems Demon was implementing. The old guard traditionalists who opposed the reforms tried one last desperate play by hiring assassins to eliminate Mira before she could give birth to an heir that would unite primordial bloodlines, and the attack came on a quiet afternoon when she was visiting one of her Omega sanctuaries outside the capital. 3 mercenaries broke through the sanctuary's defenses with military precision, and they would have succeeded in killing her if not for the enhanced senses that came with her stormborn bloodline. Mira felt the danger seconds before the attack, and her wolf surged forward with instinctive protective fury, and for the first time since her heritage was revealed, she tapped into the ancient power sleeping in her blood. Lightning literally crackled from her fingertips as she defended herself and the Omegas in her care, stormborn magic awakening in response to mortal threat, and she held off the assassins long. Enough for Demon's guards to arrive and capture them alive. Demon arrived at the sanctuary minutes later, having felt his mate's terror through their bond, and what witnesses reported would become legend throughout the kingdom. The Alpha King looked at his pregnant mate surrounded by unconscious assassins and evidence of lightning strikes, looked at the remaining mercenaries being restrained by his guards, and something ancient and terrible awakened in him. His body began to shift, but not into his normal wolf form. Instead, he transformed into something massive and terrifying that stood nearly 12 feet tall, a dire wolf of silver and shadow that radiated power like a physical force. This was the primordial alpha form that hadn't been seen in 3 centuries, only possible when a true mate bond existed between carriers of primordial bloodlines, and its appearance confirmed beyond any doubt that Demon and Mira were exactly what they claimed to be. the massive dire wolf dispatched the remaining threats with brutal efficiency and then shifted back to Demon's human form as he gathered Mira into his arms and held her while she shook with adrenaline and shock. The assassination attempt and Demon's manifestation of primordial alpha form broke the last resistance to the reforms because it proved the moon goddess herself had sanctioned this bond and this union. The traditionalists lost what little support they had left, and several prominent families who had been quietly opposing the changes suddenly became enthusiastic supporters once they realized they were fighting against divine will. Demon used the momentum to push through even more comprehensive reforms, establishing universal education for all wolves regardless of designation, creating social support systems for vulnerable populations, and fundamentally restructuring pack hierarchies to prevent the kind of abuses that the Order had exploited for so long. He also poured resources into researching primordial bloodlines and ancient magics, hoping that Mira's lightning manipulation was just the beginning of powers that could be reawakened. Mira gave birth to a healthy son 8 months after the assassination attempt, and the moment Demon held his newborn heir in his arms, he understood with perfect clarity what the Order had been so afraid of. Little Kieran had silver eyes like his father and dark hair like his mother, but he also had something unprecedented. His infant scent carried signatures of both Silvercrest and Stormborn bloodlines perfectly balanced, suggesting power potential that exceeded even primordial wolves of old. The birth was celebrated throughout the kingdom with festivals and gatherings, and common wolves spoke with wonder about the new prince who represented hope for a better future. Adrian and Celeste were cautiously delighted to have a baby brother, and watching them coo over Kieran while Demon beamed with paternal pride made Mira's heart full in ways she couldn't have imagined 2 years ago, when she was standing on an auction block waiting to be sold for scrap. The final piece of Mira's healing came when Demon's investigators finally tracked down her biological mother, a Stormborn Omega, who had been in hiding for over 2 decades after the Order murdered her mate and tried to kill her infant daughter. Elena Stormborn had believed Mira was dead, killed by the same attack that took her mate, and the reunion between mother and daughter was emotionally overwhelming for both of them. Elena explained through tears that she had been in a true mate bond with a Silvercrest Alpha, who was Demon's distant cousin, and the Order had viewed their union as dangerous because it brought primordial bloodlines too close to the throne. They had attacked when Mira was only 6 months old, killing her father and leaving Elena for dead. And in the chaos, someone had stolen the baby. Elena had spent 23 years in hiding and grief, never knowing her daughter had survived, or that the couple paid to raise her had been dosing her with poison. Elena's testimony provided the final pieces of evidence needed to completely dismantle what remained of the Order of the Crimson Moon, and her presence at court as acknowledged Stormborn matriarch gave Mira's position even more legitimacy. The two of them worked together on expanding the Omega Sanctuary system and on researching Stormborn magical heritage, and Elena proved invaluable in teaching Mira how to control the lightning abilities that had manifested during the assassination attempt. It turned out that Stormborn power was tied to protection and justice, manifesting most strongly when defending others or fighting against cruelty. And Mira's magic grew stronger as she dedicated herself to reforming systems that harmed vulnerable wolves. 5 years after Demon had claimed Mira at that auction house, the kingdom was fundamentally transformed. The Omega trade was not just illegal, but culturally abhorrent, actively prosecuted by specialized task forces that Mira had helped establish. Forced bonding was a serious crime that carried severe penalties, and Omegas had legal protections that ensured they controlled their own reproductive choices and life paths. The old aristocratic families who had relied on Order manipulation had been replaced by merit-based leadership that valued competence over bloodline, though primordial houses like Stormborn and Silvercrest retained special status because of their unique magical abilities. Education was universal, and Omega academies had proliferated across the kingdom, producing scholars and artists and political leaders who would have been considered property a generation earlier. The building that had once housed the Greyvale Auction Consortium where Mira was sold had been converted into a memorial and educational center, preserved exactly as it was, but now serving as a stark reminder of the horrors of the Omega trade and why such practices could never be allowed to return. Mira visited it sometimes when she needed to remember how far she had come, standing on the stage where she had once stood in chains and looking out at empty auction benches while reflecting on everything that had changed. Demon often accompanied her on these visits, and he would hold her hand while they stood in silence, both of them aware of how close they had come to never finding each other. Their family had grown to include not just Kieran, but twin daughters born 3 years after him, and the palace was full of laughter and chaos in the best possible way. Adrian was 18 now, and preparing to eventually take the throne, and he had grown into a thoughtful young man who took his future responsibilities seriously, while also demonstrating genuine compassion for the common wolves he would someday rule. Celeste, at 16, was showing signs of having inherited some of Mira's stormborn abilities, and she spent hours training with her grandmother Elena to develop control over electrical magic. Kieran and the twins were still young, but already showing the kind of power potential that made scholars excited about the future of primordial bloodlines. On their 5th anniversary, Demon took Mira back to the auction house memorial late at night when it was closed to the public, and he led her onto the stage under the same harsh lights that had illuminated her humiliation. But this time he knelt before her, not as a king claiming property, but as a mate, honoring his partner, and he told her that meeting her had been the single most important moment of his entire life. He thanked her for surviving long enough for him to find her, for being strong enough to endure poisoning and abuse and still emerge with her compassion intact, for taking the trauma she experienced and transforming it into systematic change that helped thousands of other Omegas escape similar fates. He told her that she was the best Luna Queen the kingdom had ever known, and the love of his life, and that their bond was the greatest gift the moon goddess had ever given him. Mira looked at this powerful alpha kneeling before her in the place where she had once been displayed as worthless merchandise, and she felt the weight of how far they had both come. She pulled him to his feet and kissed him with all the love and passion that their bond carried, and she told him that being claimed by him that day had saved her life, but the real gift was everything that came after, the choice they made every day to honor their bond through action and not just instinct. She told him that she was proud of the kingdom they were building together and the family they had created, and that she looked forward to spending the rest of her life working alongside him to make sure no other Omega ever felt as worthless as she once had. As they left the memorial hand in hand and returned to the palace where their children were sleeping and their kingdom was thriving, Mira reflected on the strange twists of fate that had brought her from that auction block to the Luna Queen's crown. She had been sold as infertile and disposable, meant to be worked to death in obscurity. But instead, she had been claimed by the most powerful alpha in the kingdom, and together they had changed the world. The girl who was told she had no value had proven that worth was never about biology or breeding. It was about courage and compassion, and the choice to fight for something better. And that lesson, more than any magical power or royal title, was the legacy she hoped to leave for her children and for the kingdom they would inherit. If this story of transformation from worthless property to powerful queen resonated with you, please like this video and share your thoughts about Mira's journey in the comments. What moment stood out to you most, and what do you think was the key to her finding not just love, but genuine empowerment? Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about Omegas who refuse to let the world define their worth, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Thank you for being part of this community, and I'll see you in the next story.